What do you want to be when you grow up? It seems like a simple, almost naive question, but it carries with it a powerful and often dangerous idea. Since childhood, we are conditioned to believe that our identity is always in the future, that we need to become something in order to be complete. James was asked this seemingly innocent question when he was just 6 years old. He looked at Enya, a friend of his mother's, and answered with the purity typical of a child. A superhero, a baseball player, and the first man on Mars. Enya, with good intentions, replied, "Keep dreaming big, you can be anything you want." But what does this answer really mean? Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the greats of existentialist philosophy, reminds us that man is condemned to be free. In other words, there is no predetermined destiny. We are the result of our choices. However, by telling a child that they can be whatever they want, we are implicitly suggesting that they are nothing yet, that they need to become something in order to have value. This seed of incompleteness planted in childhood grows over time and begins to shape our view of ourselves and the world around us. James has internalized this idea over the years. At school, he was pressured to get good grades, to excel, to get into a good college. His parents, with the best intentions, said, "You need to focus, James. Apply yourself. We know you can do much better." But what does that really mean? Why do we associate our identity with what we do or what we achieve? Friedrich Nietzsche, in his work, invites us to become who we are. He wasn't talking about achieving titles or status, but about discovering and embracing our essence. However, James, like many of us, learned to sacrifice himself for others, for expectations, for the future. He joined clubs, did internships, attended motivational talks, all in search of an answer to the question, what should I be? But as Socrates would say, an unexamined life is not worth living. True wisdom lies not in following ready-made scripts, but in questioning, reflecting, and finding your own path. Simone de Beauvoir, in The Second Sex, reminds us that human existence is a constant becoming, a process of transformation. However, she also warns of the danger of living according to external expectations, such as those James internalized as a child. When he watched motivational videos and sought advice from gurus, he was looking for a magic formula for happiness. But happiness, as Albert Camus teaches us, is not something you find at the end of a journey. You will never be happy if you keep looking for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you are looking for the meaning of life. So what do we do with this seed of incompleteness that has been planted in us since childhood? Instead of asking, what do I want to be? Perhaps the right question is, who am I now? What's more, what makes me feel alive today? Because after all, life is not a straight line leading to a glorious destination. It's a series of moments, choices, and experiences. Growing up, James learned to sacrifice himself for others, for expectations, for the future. But what about you? Are you willing to live for yourself in the present without the constant need to become something? Martin Heidegger asks us, what is called thinking? Are we really thinking when we follow ready-made formulas, or are we just repeating patterns? Life is not a race to become someone, it's a journey to discover who we already are. And maybe, like James, you need to look back and realize that the answer was never in the future, but in the now. So instead of asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? How about asking, what do you want to be today? James grew up, but the seed planted in that childhood conversation continued to sprout, fed by expectations, comparisons, and a society that values having more than being. In high school, he found himself increasingly caught in a trap, believing that his life would only have meaning if he achieved something great. He dedicated himself to his studies, joined clubs, did internships, and even attended motivational talks, all in search of an answer to the question that haunted him, what should I be? But, as the philosopher Martin Buber reminds us, everything that lives wants to become. However, he also warns us of the danger of confusing becoming with fulfilling expectations. James, in trying to fit into the mold that society and his family expected of him, began to lose sight of who he really was. He became a stranger to himself, living for a future that never came. What about you? Have you ever fallen into this trap? Have you ever felt that no matter how hard you try, it's never enough? The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer offers us a bleak but revealing perspective. Life swings like a pendulum between suffering and boredom. For James, suffering came from the pressure to achieve something, and boredom from the feeling that even when he had achieved something, there was still something missing. But there is a light at the end of this tunnel. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard invites us to a profound reflection. Life can only be understood by looking back, but it can only be lived by looking forward. As James revisited his childhood and his choices, he began to realize that the incessant quest to become something had taken him away from himself. He realized that in trying to please others, he had neglected his own passions, his own dreams. And herein lies one of life's great ironies. We often seek the future so much that we forget to live in the present. The Chinese philosopher Lao Tsé, in his Tao Te Ching, teaches us that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But he also reminds us that if we're always running towards the horizon, we'll never appreciate the path we're on. James began to question, what if I'm enough? What if what I'm looking for isn't in the future, but in the now? This question echoes the wisdom of Eckhart Tolle, who invites us to live in the present, because it is the only moment that really exists. The past is gone, the future is uncertain, but now is where life happens. However, this change of perspective is not easy. As the Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset reminds us, I am me and my circumstances. James realized that in order to reconnect with himself, he would need to face not only his own insecurities, but also the expectations that others had placed on him. He began to ask himself, what do I really want? What makes me feel alive? This journey of self-discovery is not linear. It is full of ups and downs, doubts and revelations. But, as the Roman philosopher Seneca teaches us, sometimes even living is an act of courage. James began to understand that life is not about reaching a destination, but about embracing the process. What about you? Are you willing to free yourself from the trap of becoming? To look inwards and discover who you really are, beyond expectations and labels? Life, as the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne reminds us, is a work of art in constant creation, and you are the artist. James, now a young adult, began to realize that the life he was living was not exactly his own. It was a life shaped by other people's expectations, by dreams that weren't his own, by goals that he had never really chosen. He found himself trapped in an endless cycle of seeking approval and success, but each achievement felt empty, as if something essential was missing. It was then that he came across a quote by Albert Camus that made him stop and think, "You will never be happy if you keep looking for what happiness consists of. You will never live if you are looking for the meaning of life." These words echoed in his mind like a call for radical change. James began to question everything he had been taught. Why did he need to be someone important? Why was success measured by titles, salaries, and status? He remembered how, in childhood, he had been happy simply playing, exploring, living in the moment. Where had he gone astray? It was then that he discovered the thought of Lao Tsé, the ancient Chinese philosopher, who said, "If you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present." James realized that he had spent most of his life oscillating between depression about what he hadn't achieved and anxiety about what he still needed to achieve. He had never really lived in the present. This realization was a shock, but also a relief. James began to ask himself, what do I really want? What makes me feel alive? He realized that in trying to fit into the mold that others had created for him, he had neglected his own passions, his own dreams. He remembered how, as a child, he loved drawing and creating stories. It was something he did simply because he enjoyed it, without thinking about rewards or recognition. It was then that he came across a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche that resonated deeply within him. "Become who you are." James realized that this quote wasn't about transforming himself into something he wasn't, but about discovering and embracing his true essence. He began to allow himself to explore his passions again, without fear of judgment or failure. However, this journey of self-discovery was not easy. James found himself confronted with doubts and fears. He asked himself, what if I fail? What if people don't understand my choices? It was then that he found comfort in the words of Seneca. Sometimes even living is an act of courage. He realized that true courage lay not in following the path that everyone expected him to follow, but in choosing his own path, even if it meant walking alone. James began to practice the art of living in the present. He learned to appreciate the little moments, the little joys that he had ignored for so long. He discovered that life is not a race to a glorious destination, but a series of moments that, when lived to the full, become meaningful in their own right. What about you? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you're living the life you really want? Or are you stuck in the trap of trying to become something that others expect you to be? Life, as the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne reminds us, is a work of art in constant creation, and you are the artist. At the end of this journey, James realized that the answer to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, was never in the future. It was in the present, in living each moment with authenticity and courage. What about you? Are you ready to embrace the now and discover who you really are? James, now more aware of the pitfalls that had led him away from himself, began to rebuild his life from a new point of view, that he was enough. He realized that the incessant quest to become something had led him to neglect what he already was. And, looking back, he saw that his greatest joys came from simple moments, those in which he was completely present, without worrying about the future or regretting the past. It was then that he came across an idea from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger: being is time. James began to understand that life is not a straight line leading to a destination, but a series of interconnected moments, each carrying its own essence and meaning. He realized that by trying to control the future, he had lost the ability to live fully in the now. And, as the Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti reminds us, it is not healthy to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. James began to question the values he had internalized and ask himself if they really reflected who he was. This journey of self-discovery was not easy. James found himself confronted with fears and uncertainties. He asked himself, what if I never find my purpose? What if I fail? It was then that he found comfort in the words of the Roman philosopher Epictetus. It is not things that disturb us, but the opinions we have about them. James realized that his fears didn't come from concrete facts, but from beliefs that he had accepted without question. He began to deconstruct these beliefs one by one and free himself from the bonds that prevented him from living fully. However, James also realized that this journey wasn't just about him. He began to observe the people around him and noticed that many of them were caught in the same trap he had escaped. He saw friends and family living lives that weren't really theirs, chasing dreams that weren't theirs, just to meet the expectations of others. This made him reflect on the thought of the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. Hell is other people. But James understood that this phrase was not about blaming others, but about recognizing how other people's expectations and judgments can take us away from ourselves. It was then that James decided that his journey would not only be about himself, but also about helping others to reconnect with their own essences. He began to share his discoveries, not as a guru or an expert, but as someone who had undergone a profound transformation and wanted to inspire others to do the same. He remembered the words of the Greek philosopher Socrates, "Know thyself," and he realized that this was the key to an authentic and meaningful life. James also began to practice gratitude, not as a superficial exercise, but as a way of recognizing the beauty and richness of the present. He found that by focusing on what he already had, rather than what was missing, he found a peace he had never experienced before. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius reminds us, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." James realized that his happiness didn't depend on external circumstances, but on how he chose to interpret and live each moment. How about you? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you're living the life you really want, or are you stuck in the trap of trying to become something that others expect you to be? Life, as the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne reminds us, is a work of art in constant creation, and you are the artist. At the end of this journey, James realized that the answer to the question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" was never in the future. It was in the present, in living each moment with authenticity and courage. What about you? Are you ready to embrace the now and discover who you really are? James, now more aware of himself and the world around him, began to live in a way that had previously seemed impossible. He was no longer trapped in the idea that he needed to become something in order to be happy or complete. Instead, he discovered that true freedom lay in simply being. He realized that life was not a race to a destination, but a dance where every step, every movement had its own meaning. It was then that he remembered the words of the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, "Become who you are." But James understood that this phrase wasn't about becoming something great or unattainable. It was about embracing his essence, his passions, his imperfections, and his humanity. He began to allow himself to be authentic, even when that meant being vulnerable or different from others. This new way of living brought a sense of peace that James had never experienced before. He realized that by stopping trying to please everyone and following predetermined scripts, he had found something much more valuable, the freedom to be who he really was. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre had already said, "Man is condemned to be free." James understood that this freedom was not a condemnation, but an opportunity to create his own life with its own rules and meanings. However, James also realized that this freedom came with a responsibility. He could no longer blame others for his choices or circumstances. As Austrian philosopher Viktor Frankl reminds us, between the stimulus and the response there is a space. In that space lies our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. James began to see every challenge as an opportunity for growth, every choice as a chance to reconnect with himself. He also began to understand that life was not a solitary journey. By sharing his discoveries and experiences with others, he realized that many people were struggling with the same doubts and fears he had faced. He remembered the words of the Greek philosopher Aristotle, "Man is by nature a social animal." James understood that his journey was not only about himself, but also about helping others find their own freedom. James also began to practice acceptance, not as a form of resignation, but as a way of embracing life in its entirety. He realized that by accepting what he couldn't change, he found an inner peace that allowed him to focus on what really mattered. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus teaches us, "Some things are within our control and others are not." James learned to differentiate between what he could control and what was beyond his reach, and this brought a clarity and serenity he had never known before. What about you? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself if you're living the life you really want? Or are you stuck in the trap of trying to become something that others expect you to be? Life, as the French philosopher Michel de Montaigne reminds us, is a work of art in constant creation, and you are the artist. At the end of this journey, James realized that the answer to the question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" was never in the future. It was in the present, not about becoming something, but about being who you already are. True freedom lies in embracing the present, living authentically and finding meaning in the small moments. What about you? Are you ready to stop chasing the future and start living in the now? If this video made you think, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to expand your thoughts and ideas. After all, as Socrates reminds us, an unexamined life is not worth living. Let's go on this journey of self-knowledge and growth together.